Welcome to the Trader's Edge, sponsored by Tradier. I am Jim Iuorio. That's Bob Iaccino. This is critically acclaimed Trader's Edge that one critic called smart and funny. I'm not going to stop. I'm going to say
why would you stop? Don't ever
smart
stop.
and irreverent is what he called it. Yeah. So here we have a tremendous challenge today because we are in about a minute. We're going to bring in Valina and we are going to talk about geopolitics. We like to talk about things in a kind of funny, irreverent way. And there's going to be some things that are going to have a difficult time. Remember, people, when we're laughing and joking, we're not joking about these topics. These are real people under real duress around the globe. Let's hit general markets first real quick. Gold has been stellar forever. We're going to talk about that with Valina and about the geopolitical ramifications. Is gold flashing warnings of geopolitics, or is this just saying that the treatment of our currencies domestically and globally is bullshit and you need to be in something else?
I'm going to go with the currency. It's a number of things for me, because as we treat the currency so irresponsibly, we encourage inflation down the road, and long end rates are kind of signaling that as well. Not in a strong way, but to me, there's only one sort of economic environment where stocks and gold go up at the same time, and that is with the presence of inflation, and we have central banks not fighting that inflation.
Yeah,
because people talk about gold as an inflation hedge. It's not, if the Fed is fighting inflation.
Yep. So I always say with stocks, and stocks love lower rates. Gold loves lower rates, but what they really love is rates where they believe are lower than the macroeconomic condition dictates. You know what I mean? Like they're looking and saying, dude, why'd you cut 50? Let's buy some gold. Let's buy some stocks. I think that's maybe what we're doing right now. Although I do think the labor market's falling apart, and we can get into that a little more in the show. Yeah. But anyway,
we do see real quick, that gold is moving up and positively correlating with stocks. So it fits with what you just said.
Right. But anyway, so one thing, and I always intro some of our guests like this. Bobby and I we're in legacy media for 20 years before we decided to do something that was better and on our own. You can think that Bobby and I, our opinions are bullshit and we're idiots. But one thing that is very difficult to deny is that somewhere along the way, we've made some great contacts with some unbelievable guests. And week after week, we get amazing guests. And this is going to be no exception. We have one of my favorites, Valina Chekharova, who is the Chief Global Strategist at FACE, F-A-C-E. Easy to remember, FACE. Let's bring her on right now. Valina, how are you?
Hello, first and foremost. It's great to be back. Actually, that's, I think, a very positive signal that I'm allowed to be on your show for, I think, the second time.
Appreciate that very much. We love having you on the show. And it is our honor, not yours. Yes. But thank you. I was about to tell you something before we get started. I want you to know the last time we had you on the show and the Russia-Ukraine thing was heating up in a different stage. And I'm very mixed on it. And every time I look, I just want you to know that your words were powerful and they resonated with me. You and I had a different opinion at the time. And I'm not 100% either way still. I think there are large parts of the Ukraine support that we give that is some sort of weird cousin of a money laundering operation. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be supporting Ukraine. It's a complicated issue. Can we go with that right away? Bobby, should we more nonsense? Should I ask your dogs or cats or beer or wine?
No, we've been through that with her. I really want to hit the subject.
So I hate to get serious right away, but what are your thoughts on the current condition of Ukraine versus? And by the way, before we get into these things too, I want to tell you people too, if you guys are investors in money things, there's implications with all these topics we're talking about in gold, in crude, in the dollar, in U.S. treasuries. These are market topics without any question. Let's talk about Russia, Ukraine to start.
Exactly. So my goal is actually to give you the long-term view. And we talked a lot about the long-term view, if you remember, during our first conversation. And things actually haven't changed much since then, based on what I've outlined for you. Now we are in, of course, a different phase of the war. The war is moving further to the time frame of 2025, 2026. So do not expect any big surprises until the end of this year. when it comes to negotiations or any kind of ceasefire, or even if you like peace, any kind of peace deal. What we might see first and foremost is further escalation. I think that this is right now the period ahead of the US election, which is very important for both sides for different reasons. Ukraine is in a seemingly precarious situation. It lacks the numbers. It has to go to all corners of the world to, gather the support. It's not just about the military support. It's also about diplomatic support. Right now we have, the biggest diplomatic summit in New York with more than 140 statesmen and representatives of governments going and making, their talking points from the position of their countries, and Zelensky's also there trying to gather a lot of support. But also from Russia's side, we are going to see a lot of escalation. Things are not moving, with the speed and in the scope that the Russian elite, the Russian leadership wanted it to be. And my actually scenario for this year was that if we see a big escalation coming from Moscow, and we saw it already with the, big offensive against the second largest Ukrainian city, Kharkiv, and I argue that we may see probably a second big offensive by the end of this year coming from Moscow. It actually is a signal. This is just something now to make it more spicy for your listeners.
Like that.
That Moscow probably anticipates a re-election of Trump, because they know for a fact that Trump is going to be more open towards negotiations, direct talks with Moscow. So for them to gain as much of territory as possible was and remains on the agenda ahead of this election. But this was, of course, a decision taken based on the status quo before Biden was replaced with Kamala Harris. So now we have a new situation there. But anyway, long story short, 2024, we'll see some really big surprises in terms of escalation, military escalation on both sides. I mean, Ukraine, the very fact that Ukraine dared to penetrate to the Russian territory and conduct a successful, at least at the beginning, successful military operation on Russian ground. The development of drones. I mean, this war has so many dimensions and so many sides that we can cover. But also from Russia's point of view, of course, the preparation for, as I said, 2025, 2026. And in the meantime, a lot of peace initiatives will be coming from countries like China, like India, Brazil, obviously the US, the G7 countries. So we are in this context when it comes to the war.
So let me ask this. I kind of alluded to something a second ago, and I want your honest opinion. By the way, Bobby and I, we can be told that we're full of shit and we're wrong anytime, and we don't take it to heart. Is it reasonable for me to have great concern that with the amount of money that's being thrown around, that there is a potential for grift, a potential for money coming back to certain politicians who promote the war for Ukraine on Ukraine's side? Is that reasonable, or is it idiotic?
You are alluding to corruption.
I am.
And the question of corruption is omnipresent in these kind of situations where you have to deal with hundreds of billions of US dollars. I mean, that is not really, my expertise. I'm not an expert on corruption cases and investigations when it comes to, for instance, links, because we have such people who are also looking on both sides. They're looking also into cases linked to Ukrainian politicians or whatever. But the same goes, in the other direction. I cannot, I can neither confirm nor deny, these kind of allegations. But this would be just a personal opinion on my side without being based on any expertise. My expertise is in a very different is in a very different, context and very different corner. Here we talk about the big question of, and I understand it very well, because it's a question that bothers many Americans right now in this situation in which we are on both sides of the Atlantic, with the skyrocketing prices, even though that our central banks are claiming the opposite, and so on and so forth. Why are our countries giving so much money to Ukraine? I mean, I think this is what you really want to go to the bottom of, right? Why should our governments on both sides of the Atlantic spend hundreds of billions of euro and dollars for a war that is not ours? This is something I hear very often. And I can tell you the short answer to this is that the costs that will emerge out of the new situation, that is to allow Russia to, practically subjugate Ukraine. I mean, we know for a fact, if Ukraine stops receiving any military aid, that's it. It's over. It's capitulation par excellence. And then, of course, the expectation is that, Russia will not stop only in the 4 regions that are not even fully under Russian control. Russia will, grow bigger appetite for more territory. And yes, we have some theorists from the realist school saying that Russia doesn't need territory. But if you read the manifest of the Russian Orthodox Church, and we know that Mr. Putin is a very, very big fan of the Russian Orthodox Church, they are putting it quite clearly what they really strive for. They strive for all of it, for the territory, for the raw materials, the minerals, the population. They want to have Russia that has 600 million people one day. Right now, Russia has 142. Okay, just to give you one idea. And that means that immediately following such scenario, the costs for the transatlantic partnership, because United States is obviously the strongest partner within NATO, will skyrocket by a factor of 100 probably, because we will have collectively we will have to spend much more money for security and stability, having to deal with a really overwhelming geopolitical actor that is directly at the gate of the European Union, and by extension, as I said, by NATO.
So, Velina, I want to first make a couple statements that I believe to be true, right? And I hope it doesn't turn out to be one of those Mark Twain situations where it's not so much ignorance of the things we don't know as the ridiculousness of the things we think we do. I butchered that quote, but it's somewhere along that lines. I believe it to be true that there was an agreement to not expand NATO when the Berlin Wall fell. And I believe it to be true that the US did not comply with that agreement. Whether it was a treaty or not, I honestly don't know. I just know there was an agreement to not expand NATO past where it was already. And the West did expand NATO. And then I believe it to be true that there was another agreement that Ukraine would never be offered NATO membership. Now, what I don't know, and you can tell me if those are wrong in your answer, they may be wrong. And what I don't know is, was there an actual conversation, whether directly or through diplomatic channels, where during the invasion of Crimea, Vladimir Putin made it clear that this was due to NATO incursion into territories they promised not to incur upon? And was this invasion by Russia driven by the idea that NATO would expand to Russia's borders, which is what the US and the West agreed they would never do? How much of that is right and how much of that is wrong?
Well, you're asking questions which I think historians and political scientists will be dealing with for decades in the future, right? Mm-hmm. Because we do not have the full disclosure of documents, of information. So even though that, for instance, I have followed a lot of this, a lot of these events over the last 20, 25 years. And so did many other colleagues. Still, this is again only very, very subjective and very partial
So
perspective.
those things I said are not fact, as we know.
No, it's not. Nothing of what you said actually is a straightforward fact.
Okay, that's great to
That's
know.
the first thing. Second, let's start unpacking it a little bit. And again, I mean, I will try to be as short as possible, because I'm sure that we have also a lot of other, more relevant and more urgent geopolitical topics to discuss. I'm also not a historian, first and foremost, and second, I'm not a classic political scientist, because this hasn't been my my primary expertise. But just recently, there has been a book published by Mary Sarotte, who actually looked into the documents from this period.
What was her name again? I'm sorry.
I started now first and foremost with the first question that relates to what the West promised to Russia at the time, when Russia was already at the stage of in a desolate state prior to the official implosion. And there were already conversations, and immediately after that there were conversations. And in reality, we have this Russian narrative. We've always had this Russian narrative that the West had promised, to the Soviet Union that there won't be any NATO's expansion, right? This is the one main narrative,
Right,
that we had. Yeah. And here, I think now, slowly but surely, new documents are emerging. Historians are already having the access to different libraries. Mary Sarotte is one of these, people who have published a whole book with all the documents there. And, the short answer is that such promise has never been formalized in any binding treaty between the West and the Soviet Union.
okay, so no treaty that we're aware of.
No, there is no binding treaty. And you understand what it means for politicians to make promises, no matter whether these are politicians in the West or in Russia. Can we agree on that? That
Absolutely.
Politicians actually make promises with the idea to, let's say, arrive at a compromise or to push forward certain talks, but they do not actually make promises with the idea to stick to them and to keep them. Can we agree on that? I think that
Absolutely, we can.
Absolutely, yes.
This is fair. So no binding treaty. And I think that, of course, the truth is somewhere in between. Obviously, because we may also argue that Russia had a certain assurance on behalf of Western representatives in various talks that this NATO expansion, by the way, NATO expansion is the Russian narrative, because you expand, you know how you expand as a state power, you expand by using military force. You expand against the will of another country. This is how you expand, right?
Right.
We also can agree on the vocabulary that you enlarge if it's happening on a free will, based on the free will of those that want to become a member. Think of NATO, for instance, as an organization where every single country so far wanted to become a member. And I can tell you from the experience of Central Eastern European countries that at the beginning of the time after the end of the Soviet Union, after the end of the Soviet bloc, the very first thought that these governments had in mind was not about European Union enlargement. It was not about joining the European Union and the common market. It was actually only about getting security guarantees. And the only way how to get security guarantees against the possible aggression on behalf of Russia, because they were fearing that Russia might, try to seize some territories, was by joining NATO. And because it was not possible to join just NATO. It was transatlantic, partnership. It had very clear conditions to join, which were based on the way how your political system was working, your liberal economic model was built. None of this was existent, immediately after 1990, and also, of course, how what kind of principles your society was working on, namely human rights, freedoms, and so on and so forth. So in reality, NATO enlargement versus NATO expansion. So we start already actually creating perceptions by the use of specific words. Now, coming to more recent times, because you also asked the question about Ukraine wanting to join NATO, Georgia wanted to join NATO, and then, practically following the summit, the NATO summit, what happened in 2008 was practically the decision of Russia to make a move on Georgia. And similarly, some were arguing Ukraine was next because it wanted to join NATO as well. And this is the main, so to say, narrative coming also from specific theoretical school of American and some European realists, claiming that because this is the strategic sphere of influence of Russia, this is the so-called near uproad, this is the immediate neighborhood of Russia, Russia perceives it as a direct security threat, and because of that, it has to interfere, it has to be aggressive, it has to actually attack, right? But in 2014, when Russia took the decision to take Crimea, Ukraine was neutral, because one of the conditions for the beginning of the war in 2022 was for Ukraine to become neutral. Just to give you, an idea how short the memory of people is, and because people don't have the time to follow all of these, nuances and details. In reality, Ukraine was a neutral country. Now, you understand that a neutral country cannot join a military, in this case, NATO is defense alliance, but some define it, again, we talk about narratives, define it as a military bloc. So a neutral country cannot join a military bloc. I'm based in Vienna, in Austria, and Austria is a neutral country. So Austria does not allow any foreign military bases on its ground, and it is officially not joining any military blocs or defense alliances. Okay, so it is in itself a contradiction, right? To claim that Ukraine, even though that part of the elite, of the Ukrainian elite, following the events, what happened to Georgia in 2008, and then in 2013 we had a very big, and previously there were also other, of course, events at home. And the leadership in Ukraine, as well as society, was very, very, very much split. So there was a part that was strongly pro-Russian, and then there was a part that was strongly pro-Western. So it wasn't very clear. It wasn't very clear at that time in which direction Ukraine wants to go. But slowly but surely, it was already emerging in a kind of emancipation away from Russia. And in the follow-up of events in 2014, Russia reacted to the decision of Ukraine to actually take a very clear and straightforward pro-Western stance. And that means somewhere in the future, and you know how future is defined, especially from the perspective of politicians. It could be in 20 years, it could be in 30 years from now, there was this goal of transatlantic enlargement on behalf of Ukraine.
So do you think there's anything to Vladimir Putin saying his preference is Kamala Harris, or do you think he was just kind of trolling the American media when he said that?
I think that he was trolling. I think that he obviously is playing his psychological games with the American people. And I think that it really has, to some extent, has achieved what he was intending to achieve. First and foremost, he did the same with Biden. He gave an interview for Russian media, and this interview was immediately translated, obviously, social media. And in this interview, he said that he's clearly in favor of Biden. Okay, so that was the first, signal, in my view, where it was, it was very clear that this is not his, that he won't actually reveal his true intentions.
Right.
What he pursues with, let's say, any kind of U.S. presidential outcome, and also from Russian point of view. Now, we may argue that from China's point of view, even from, if you like, from Iranian point of view, the re-election of a Democrat president is a better news. We see clearly that despite the conflict, the systemic conflict with China, the Biden administration made certain steps towards normalization of the relationship, towards diplomatic meetings and so on and so forth. I can also say a little bit more about it later. But when it comes to Russia, Trump is certainly the more desired candidate because of the clear understanding of Trump has about the systemic rival being China, and at the same time the perception Trump has about Russia, and that is that Russia is no longer a great power of the same scale as United States. China,
Yeah, he doesn't see them as a threat.
And exactly. But what he also understands is that he can find a common ground with Trump. So probably there are some more issues there, but certainly from Russia's point of view, now being in the third year of the war, Russia also wants this war, to come to an end at some point of time in the future. So I think that Putin understands that with a guy like Trump, he will have better cards. So of course, then he will be playing this psychological warfare on the Western, population, whether it's about the Americans or the Europeans, by claiming something that he doesn't think.
Yeah. So here, and again, I want to put a bow on this because I want to move to China and Iran and the global implications for the dollar, but I want to put a bow on something real quick about what Bobby asked. And again, this is, even if you accept what you do, and I accept most of what you're saying too, were there moments over the last 15 years when the voluntary enlargement of NATO was proposed or actually happened, where you, Valina, said to yourself, oh shit, this puts us on a direct path where Putin is going to feel threatened and flex his muscles? Right or wrong? Was it predictable, is all I'm saying?
To me personally, I haven't seen in that context in any phase of the last 15 years. In fact, it was clear that at some point of time in the future, Russia will re-emerge economically and in terms of trade. Russia was at its lowest point in the 90s, was really, really very, very weak and struggling.
We knocked the shit out of oil. We should do that again, don't you think? We could push oil down to $9 a barrel like we did in the 80s. We'd break apart those guys. That's the way to do it.
Good luck with that, I would say. But yeah, so definitely, I think that there is a fallacy in the thinking in many, current analysts, and I understand that, especially those who are younger, who haven't dealt with Russia. But I've been through the period when Russia was fighting secessionist movements at home, territories that wanted to split from Russia. Then we had, it was very bad period. Terrorist attacks inside of Russia. Russian Federation was, facing a situation at some point where there was a serious risk of kind of dissolvement, at least partial dissolvement. And now you will be surprised which actor on the global arena was absolutely against it.
China.
And actually made everything possible, including through financial flows, to prevent it from happening.
Who? China?
The United States.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
The United States never wanted, after the 90s, actually desolate and dissolved Russian Federation. And in fact, they really did their best to somehow, put it together. A lot of, financial help was flooding into Russia at that time in the 90s. Then later there was also, a default situation. And by the time when, things slowly but certainly started deteriorating between the two, let's say, blocks. At that time, there weren't there weren't blocks, but Russia realized that they were never meant to be part. But at the same time, the West realized that it was practically and physically impossible to really, integrate such player as Russia into any transatlantic, kind of infrastructure, especially when it comes to NATO or the European Union. But they did actually other things, like what is little to almost not known, for instance, is that on the European side, Brussels, so the institutions and also the big players, the big countries, they had like this Russia first policy towards the whole region. Like it was not about Ukraine, it was not about Georgia, it was not about any of these countries. Most of the people in Europe couldn't even, point to these countries on the map. Just, wanted to make you feel a little bit better that it's not only the Americans who are in this position very often when it comes to geography.
You're terrible at it.
It was really about Russia first, So a lot of trade, a lot of modernization, technological transfer, scientific exchange, young people, people-to-people exchange. So a lot of things were happening, in this in these first 2 decades, and the cherry of it is probably you've heard about it. It was this German concept about Wander durch Handel, which is practically meaning we are going to transform the relationship and the country through trade. So we are going to build such a big trade portfolio, which in fact happened, that Russia will never see any incentive into making any kind of stupid move like showing any aggression. But in reality, and this is now my point, it was just a matter of time, because Russia is, is having the DNA of an empire, and you cannot change the DNA of an empire that hasn't seen a century without, enlargement, without expansion. So in every single century there has been an expansion. So from the moment when Russia grew stronger and more assertive and realized that it can actually start getting a revenge, I think that this was the time. It started with 2008, as I said, with the Georgian intervention. Still, the military was very weak at that time. Really, they performed very bad. I mean, you're talking about bad performance now, but we have the second largest European country on the old continent, which is Ukraine. And in 2008, it was really, the performance was really pitiful. So in a sense, they adapted a lot. They, innovated a lot. They, spent a lot of money, and the rest is history. So right now, what we are seeing is a reemergence of Russia on the global arena. So it's not going to be only Ukraine. It's going to be about much, much more. Now, final point on my side, if my working hypothesis is correct, and I'm not saying it is, but the reality will show, and we can discuss it next year. It means that Russia realizes I'm not going to be the systemic player of the size and scale of like China, definitely not like United States, but I can be the joker in this newly shaped relationship. I can be this, game changer that can swing, the weight in the relationship. So right now we see a very strong relationship with China. The two countries have never been that close in the history of the bilateral relationship. And at the same time, after the election, everything is opened for, let's say, for the next chapter of the U.S.-Russia relations.
So I want to talk about.
I know you want to go on, Jimmy, and so do I, because I definitely want to talk about Iran, because it has to do with oil and markets and inflation and all that. But what you just said, does that mean, and this is not a political statement, it's a legitimate question, does that mean perhaps Donald Trump has the right thought in his head to appeal to Russia to a certain degree, so that the relationship, the sort of spoiler relationship you described, shifts more to the West and away from China, seeing that I think we all three can agree that from the perspective of the US, at least economically, China is the bigger enemy?
Indeed, but right now Russia sees more opportunities. So the relationship, this modus vivendi that has been built over the last 10 years between China and Russia is so strong because it's entailing very different strategic domains. It's not just about the commodities. It's not just about the raw materials. It's not just about the transport corridors that they are planning to build together as an alternative to US-controlled, for instance, maritime lines. Think of the Arctic that is going to be exploited and is going to be, used for new maritime corridors that will significantly shorten the shipping between Asia and Europe, just to give you one example. It's also not only about the fourth industrial revolution and the technological domain, where Russia is receiving a lot right now from China, but it's also about the question of peace and war. Here we talk about the whole military industrial complex and the defense sector. And here again, Russia sees a lot of opportunities, but China also gets a lot from this relationship because China is preparing, for the tensions in South China Sea and East China Sea, because this is going to be the epicenter of geopolitics in this and probably in the next decade. It's not going to be about Eastern Europe or about the Middle East. So the biggest geopolitical hotspot is going to be in South China, in East China, along the choke points in the Indo-Pacific, and obviously China can get some interesting technological defense capabilities, for instance, from Russia. Last but not least, Russia has the Soviet playbook, right? From the first Cold War. Now, in the context of the second Cold War between United States and China and Russia, you have also the ideological component. So you deal with the whole global South, and most of the economic growth, most of the commodities are where? They are actually in the global South, where China, of course, has its way of, winning hearts and minds through, let's say, trade projects or infrastructure projects. But Russia has also its channels and networks, how to win hearts and minds, for instance, through ideological competition, the bad colonialists or the bad capitalists there, the communist ideology is alive and kicking, and Russia can revive it together with China. They can coordinate. They can also coordinate spying activities. They can coordinate on hybrid operations and so on and so forth. So the playbook is very comprehensive, and I just cannot see any scenario in the short term, no matter whether it's going to be Kamala Harris or Trump, that will enable a U.S. government to, so to say, to convince the Russian leadership, on top of which is Putin, but tomorrow maybe it will be another one, another Putin, doesn't matter really, but to convince them that it really makes sense and it's worth it to look away from China.
Yeah. So I want to switch to the dollar ramifications of the China-Russia thing, but this is a statement more than anything. It just saddens me that generations in this country view Russia as this militaristic cast off on the Bolsheviks, and nobody ever thinks beyond that to the rich history, the art, the Tchaikovsky's, they were so advanced a society, and then all of a sudden you throw in socialism, communism, and it turns to shit so quickly. My question is going to be, though, Bobby and I have been talking about gold as a strategic trade for the last couple of years. Part of it is because we have a government here that spends like drunken sailors. Second part of it is we have governments all over the world that also spend like drunken sailors. The third part of it is the China, Russia, Iran, throw in whatever other countries you want, is their resolve strong enough to move away from the dollar and start stockpiling gold and divest themselves of U.S. treasuries? Is it a big deal, little deal, or no deal for these global safe haven assets and the dollar specifically?
My perspective on this is it's going to be not just a big or very big deal. It's going to be probably one of the biggest game changers for the shifting global order.
And what kind of
so
time
much-
frame add into? Yeah.
It's going to start probably manifesting by the end of this year already. And so my expectation, because it's been in the making for quite some time now, especially in the last 3 years. I mean, we've seen sanctioned countries before, like Iran, like Venezuela. They could operate in a context of sanctions quite well. And Russia, in preparation for the war in 2020, for the launch of the war in 2022, had done its homework. So it was prepared. It had the shadow fleet already, in place. But the point is the scale, the sheer scale of a country that is, it cannot be just erased out of the equation of a highly interconnected world. This is no longer Soviet Union. When Soviet Union collapsed, nobody cared in the West because it wasn't connected to the West, to the Western socioeconomic networks. It wasn't connected. So we cared, who were part of the Soviet bloc, because we all suffered from the consequences of the implosion. But outside, nobody cared. Now this is a different story. And I think that, it started slowly in the last 3 years when, countries that are key partners of Russia, because of, let's be real, because of relatively cheap, always available and predictable supply of raw materials. And I do not mean only energy, I mean food, I mean fertilizers, I mean minerals, and so on and so forth.
Timber, the biggest timber exporter in the world. Yeah, I mean,
countries that are meant to grow, that want to grow, they want to industrialize in the context of this new, industrial revolution, the fourth industrial revolution, which is also going to demand even more, require even more commodities and more specifically use of, for instance, electricity. So there you go. You have the largest combined gas and oil supplier in the world. You cannot erase it, right? So countries like China, but also like India, and many from this top list. Now we saw this Ray Dalio's list, right? He published this list of countries that will grow in the next 10 years. So if you look at the list, and they picked 83 different indicators for the choice of countries. So if you take a look at this list, you have on the top of the list, at least from the first 10 countries, BRICS plus and candidates for BRICS plus. So that means huge trade portfolio. These countries will grow economically at home, and they will need, they will need to deepen the trade relations with each other. So that gives you also the answer to the question that they will have to come up with some sort of payment mechanism. They will have to agree on something that is not going to be the Chinese yuan, obviously, and it's not going to be the Russian ruble, right? We agree on that this just doesn't make any sense, mostly because of trust issues. Like the Indians will never allow, and the Russians wanted them to pay in Chinese yuan. Meanwhile, the portfolio of Russian oil in India is 45%, but they refused for their own geopolitical reasons. So it's going to be something different, and they do not trust the dollar because the dollar can always be weaponized.
As it was.
It was. That's a reasonable thing. Yeah. They did this, and they locked Russia out of the SWIFT payments, and they seized up Russian assets. This was a big deal. If you're going to be the arbiter and the arbiter of the world's trade and the head of the global currency, you have a responsibility to be, I don't know, distant in that. And we shut everything down. Was that a good move by the U.S., or did that just make our enemies, give them greater resolve to divest themselves of the dollar?
Well, it made them certainly resilient. And at some point of time in the future, it will make them anti-fragile. The perpetual weaponization of the dollar has actually led to unanticipated consequences.
Not by us, by the way.
I mean, the Russians wanted, they always dreamt of having some alternative to the dollar, but it's one thing when it is about dreams, and it's another thing when it's about reality. So here I'm talking about the reality, the strategic necessity to come up with some sort of payment mechanism, which works for all of them. What do I think might be one avenue? I'm not saying it's going to happen that way, but this is what I'm following and I'm thinking of. Let me just present some hypotheses, my current working hypothesis. So first thing is, this is probably going to be something like a basket. I mean, think of the SDR basket of IMF, which is still working. By the way, think of Egypt. Egypt is probably the biggest geopolitical collateral of three simultaneously happening crises and conflicts right now. Russia, Ukraine, the crisis in Red Sea, and then we have the military conflict in the Middle East. And the IMF actually provided a loan, So this basket would entail gold for sure. That is, the answer to your question why, all of these countries are also big buyers and they are really stockpiling gold. But then again, of course, there will be some certain share of national currencies. So they will call it something like BRICS plus basket probably. And they will put also commodities, because commodities is the new currency, right? If you have BRICS plus club, this is something that is turning into the next like OPEC plus, right? But it's bigger in a sense that it's not only about oil, it's about everything. Like you have food suppliers there, you have food producers there, you have energy, all kind, right? So you will have some sort of commodities. And now we come to the point where we think how exactly this should work. What exactly is going to be the mechanism there? And you probably, there was this big story of in Germany of a financial pyramid, Wirecard. So Wirecard, was a digital payment system, which crashed in Germany. It was, as I said, financial pyramid. But guess what happened to the guys who were in charge? They fled to Russia. Okay, so now who is giving the know-how of how to facilitate the biggest digital payment, platform that has been working for quite some time. I have friends who have used it for, their businesses. It was practical, but it was just, was destined to fail right from the beginning because it was, a pyramid, financial pyramid. Anyway, so probably there will be some sort of digital system behind it, yes. And why did I say this year? Because this year we have a very interesting coincidence of two events. We have G20, which is surpassing now G7, as we know, in taking place in Brazil. And we have Lula in Brazil, who is absolutely behind Russia. And then we have the BRICS Plus summit taking place in Kazan in Russia this year. It's a rotation principle. So this year is in, so it makes perfect sense to me to coordinate these two events and then to really come up with something big. And then we have also Turkey applying for a membership. Saudi Arabia, I mean, depending on the time frame of the military conflict in the Middle East, might also announce that it's joining. It was invited to join, but it hasn't announced yet. So these are kind of events starting with 2025. I expect actually the manifestation to start seeing first signals towards how this kind of mostly barter-like trades happening between within the context of BRICS Plus. Right now we have a lot of barter, bilateral barter. You have fertilizers, I have weapons. Okay, let's swipe. But to facilitate it in the next step will be, now I have a lot of let's say I have a huge account of 50 billion in your banks. I cannot get the money because I'm out of the SWIFT. That's the Russian case, right? So Indian banks, for instance, cannot transfer the money. The money is stuck there for the oil purchase. What are you going to do with it, right? So you have already the test ground to start experimenting. And I'm expecting that this is going to be the next phase.
The last question I have for you, Velina, from me anyway, is I don't know if the Middle East is within your expertise at all, but I want your opinion as to whether this is going to expand. And the reason I bring it up, obviously, we focus a lot on financial markets. And one of the things I've said about crude oil is there's been a few crude oil spikes where we think we see an escalation of some of the military activity in the Middle East, but it hasn't quite affected an actual producer, a substantial producer of crude oil. Now, obviously, Iran changes that. We do have recognition of Israel from Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but the biggest obvious risk to supply is Iran. So do you expect that to explode, for lack of a better word? I was trying to think of a word.
Accelerate, I thought you were going to go with.
Yeah, do you expect it to get worse in the Middle East or better?
Mm-hmm. I have worked with my own geopolitical scenarios on the Middle East as well, right from the first day of, let's say, from 7th of October, I had scenarios for the region. Mm-hmm. And here is my short answer. The risk of broader military conflict in the Middle East is still relatively low because there is no readiness and no willingness on behalf of the key geopolitical players in the region, including Iran, anyway, Israel, further and we are looking at, the key players on the global arena like United States, China, and Russia, which are also present, which are also interfering, which are also, playing a role. Zero readiness and willingness for different geopolitical reasons. And this is actually the key indicator we are looking at. So that means that, yes, like in every military conflict, there might be a black swan event. Yes, I'm not denying it. But even now, in every single escalation phase, and right now we are in another escalation phase because, again, one of the Iranian proxies This time is Hezbollah in Lebanon is very active, and Israel is taking, steps. And we have already a very, very precarious situation in Gaza itself. So even now in this escalatory phase, I don't see the readiness on behalf of any of these sectors, even on behalf of Israel, to start actually full-scale war against Lebanon, and at the same time to continue the military operation against Hamas, and at the same time to face, the severe consequences at home and, in the Middle East because of its actions. No, this is a conflict in which right from the beginning there was one particular player that wanted a change of the status quo. We had, before the 7th of October, normalization of the relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia under the Chinese umbrella. We had actually steps towards normalization of the relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel under American umbrella. We had the Russians, keeping a low profile because of the difficulties they were facing in the war against Ukraine. And in reality, the region and especially the Gulf states, but even to a great extent Iran, wanted to move on and to really focus on economics rather than military conflict and geopolitics. They wanted, because of the situation at home post-COVID, very high numbers of young people who were jobless, and so on and so forth, for different reasons. The region wanted to move on into a new context. And then we had also in September 2023 the situation where a new transport corridor was announced as a competition to the Silk Road of China, announced by the Americans, by the Europeans, by the Gulf states, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the Indians, to connect this, huge trade space. So do you think that you are going to announce this kind of big business projects, that you are going to invest so much political capital in normalization of relations with a regional rival that, as you can imagine, has never good optics at home for parts of society, while having actually war in mind? No. So out of all these hotspots, the military conflict in the Middle East is going to be the first coming to an end, at least for some period of time in the future, of course, with devastating consequences for the political leadership in Israel, and obviously with devastating humanitarian cost for the Palestinians.
Right, which is already up, of course. Yeah, this has been an amazing conversation. I would love to be sitting around a table with drinks for about 3 hours, picking your brain about things. I so appreciate you coming on and talking to us. Can you tell the people where to find you?
Yes, the easiest way to find me is actually on Twitter, on X, V Chakarova. And if you want to subscribe to my free newsletter, I have a weekly newsletter where I point to some of the most interesting geopolitical events happening in, that have happened in the past week. You can go to my webpage, which is foraconsciousexperience.com. This is FACE, practically based in Vienna. And sorry for not touching upon China. I think that we should we have to continue with
No doubt. But I wish we could too. But we have producers who, we can't keep going on and on. You know what I mean? We got to cut it short. Bobby, we do, right? I mean, I'd stay.
We do. We have a time limit on these, unfortunately, but on our other one, we don't. So we will, I'm going to reach out to you and get you scheduled to talk more about this, because I learn so much every time I talk to you.
Me too.
It
and
really does end
the way
up.
I think, which I hate that, by the way.
But it really does end up with, I found the Mark Twain quote, which actually might have been Josh Billings.
It's not what you know it's not what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's what you know that just ain't so.
That's basically it. Josh Billings had one a little earlier.
May I say something for the sake of clarification? Yeah. My approach, actually, the way how I work with scenarios and trying to anticipate the future, never make any predictions, is practically to work only with the unknown. So I understand that there are a lot of known, unknowns where people claim to know things, but I actually deal with the things I don't know. And then I try to develop different scenarios to, put in as many factors, and variables as possible of different nature, and then to just really try to estimate. I try to estimate the likelihood, of one or other scenario. This is what I've been presenting to you practically when I was saying, this scenario or that scenario, is because I do understand that the best way to be positioned actually in crises is to work with the uncertainties.
Yeah, I love that. But there's a fun question, just so I don't think about global war the whole time. If we were sitting around a table discussing this for 3 hours, what would you be drinking? Whiskey?
I quit drinking.
Did you? The old Valina. Vodka or no? Because I drink vodka. What?
Yes, of course.
Of course, right.
Vodka, yes, certainly.
Good. Well, thank you so much for being here. It is our honor to host you here because I think you have such a wealth of information on this stuff. Thank you so much. Thank you to you guys for watching. This is the Tradiers, the Trader's Edge. I'm Jim Iuorio. That's Bob Iaccino. Remember, we appreciate your support so much. All the DMs, the retweets, all the people who are watching us live. None of this works without you. Bobby and I were in legacy media for 20 years, and we were always having to couch our opinion based on the whims of overzealous producers and big sponsors. We are trying to create a platform that is independent of that, and we are winning, and we are winning because you guys are helping. Thank you.
You know how the financial world goes. Here comes the buzzkill. Please make sure to take some time to read this boring disclaimer. We will owe you one.